I never really understood how Melissa Walker and I spent so many years circling one another without ever forming anything resembling an actual friendship. In high school, she lived in a permanent state of cool detachment, sharp-tongued and effortlessly admired, the kind of girl who could ruin someone's day with a single raised eyebrow. She acted like I barely existed unless she needed to make it clear I wasn't part of her world, yet somehow we ended up in the same groups, the same weekend hangouts, even the same late-night fast food runs when the whole crowd piled into cars after a football game. I didn't hate her, but she made it incredibly easy to feel small, and I always assumed we'd drift apart permanently the moment graduation ceremonies ended. And, for a while, that's exactly what happened. She left for college far from our small Texas town, and I stayed behind, working at a large electronics store and figuring out how to be an adult without any real plan. My days were spent selling televisions and sound systems, explaining resolutions and refresh rates to customers who barely cared, and pretending I didn't mind that everyone else my age seemed to be moving on faster than me. One morning, halfway through a shift, I saw a new face in the appliance department. She was speaking with my manager, laughing at something he said, her smile warm enough to melt even the worst customer service exhaustion. For a moment, I didn't recognize her, but when she turned slightly, the connection clicked instantly. It was Barbara Walker, Melissa's mom. She had the kind of beauty time didn't touch, an elegant confidence paired with an approachable warmth that made people lean closer without realizing it. Even from across the store, she looked like someone who had lived entire lives and still somehow stayed open to the world. When the manager waved me over to introduce us, I felt strangely nervous, as though I'd stepped into some alternate reality where nothing connected to Melissa followed normal rules. Barbara reached out and took my hand, greeting me like we already knew each other, and I was immediately struck by how different she was from her daughter. Where Melissa was razor-edged and controlled, Barbara felt steady, inviting, capable of making you relax without saying a word. Working with her quickly became one of the best parts of my job. We fell into an easy rhythm, teasing each other during shifts, sharing stories about ridiculous customers, laughing about how the two of us always seemed to get stuck organizing the most chaotic aisles. She made even slow evenings feel lively. I'd catch myself looking forward to the days she was scheduled, wondering why our conversations lingered in my head long after I clocked out. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. She was Melissa's mom, after all. But something about the way she listened made me feel more seen than anyone my age ever had. She'd tilt her head slightly when I talked, really absorbing what I said, not rushing, not distracted, just present in a way that felt rare. Everything shifted one 4th of July. A group of us gathered in the parking lot behind the store after a long shift, leaning against cars as distant fireworks burst above the rooftops. Someone was whining about how long it had been since they'd been on a date, and people laughed and rolled their eyes. Then Barbara, sipping a Coke, said with surprising casualness that she'd been divorced for 2 years, and no one had even tried asking her out. The moment hung strangely in the humid air, like the universe had paused to wait for someone to react. Before I could stop myself, I joked that I was off Monday and could take her out if she wanted. It wasn't a real offer, at least I thought it wasn't. But when she looked at me thoughtfully, smiled, and said, "Sure," something electric passed between us. My heart pounded as she handed me her number, and even though I tried to play it cool, I knew immediately that everything had changed. When Monday came, I spent far too long deciding what to wear for what was supposed to be a casual dinner. I drove to a small Italian restaurant outside of town, trying not to overthink the whole situation. But the moment Barbara stepped out of her car, dressed simply yet effortlessly stunning, my breath caught in my throat. The evening unfolded with a kind of gentle intensity I hadn't expected. Conversation flowed easily across flickering candlelight. Her laughter seemed to dissolve whatever awkwardness lingered between us. We fell into a quiet comfort that felt too natural for a first date, like two people picking up a conversation they didn't realize they'd started months ago. After dinner, neither of us wanted the night to end, so we caught a late showing of a movie at a nearly empty theater. I felt her shift closer, the armrest between us folding up smoothly, and when she rested her head lightly against my shoulder, something warm and fragile moved through my chest. It wasn't dramatic or wild. It was subtle, grounding, the kind of moment that lingers long after the credits fade. Later that evening, when I parked near her car to drop her off, we ended up talking for nearly 2 hours, the windows fogging slightly as the night cooled around us. She opened up about her life after the divorce, her worries about Melissa leaving home, her attempts to start over in a place that still reminded her too much of the past. I listened, captivated not by the details themselves, but by the vulnerability in her voice. I could feel the air between us thickening with something unspoken, but I held back, unsure whether stepping forward would shatter the delicate balance forming between us. When she finally left my car, I watched her go with equal parts thrill and disbelief. The next evening, she showed up at my place unexpectedly. I barely had time to register the knock before she stepped inside, her expression conflicted and determined. She didn't make small talk. Instead, she crossed the space between us and kissed me, a soft but certain pull that carried the weight of everything we'd exchanged the night before. The world seemed to narrow to the warmth of her hands, the nearness of her breath, the quiet urgency in how she held me. We moved together slowly, discovering the boundaries of this new connection, keeping everything restrained but deeply emotional, letting closeness speak where neither of us could. It wasn't reckless so much as inevitable, shaped by every moment that had drawn us together since the day she walked into the store. After that, we found ways to see each other constantly. We texted during breaks, arranged overlapping shifts when possible, shared inside jokes that made coworkers raise their eyebrows without understanding. It was exhilarating and nerve-wracking, like living inside a secret too precious to expose. We weren't just sneaking around because of the age difference or the improvised boundaries between us. We were afraid of one person in particular, Melissa. The thought of her discovering what was happening felt like a fuse waiting to be lit. Still, neither of us stepped back. If anything, the secrecy intensified the connection, pulling us closer. But within a few weeks, I sensed something changing. Barbara grew distracted. She'd get calls she refused to answer in front of me, her eyes darkening for a moment before she forced a smile. Sometimes she would fall silent in the middle of a conversation, her thoughts drifting somewhere far away. When I gently asked if everything was okay, she insisted it was just work stress or family issues. But the unease in her voice wasn't something she could disguise, and eventually it seeped into everything, leaving a subtle tension between us that neither of us dared confront directly. One afternoon, while I was out running errands, I ran into Melissa. She was surprisingly friendly, almost too friendly, making small talk like nothing had ever been strange between us. She mentioned casually that her mom had been working with me a lot, and then added something in her tone, too light, too careful, that made my stomach twist. I brushed it off at first, but the encounter stuck with me, replaying in my mind the rest of the day. Something about her smile felt wrong, like she knew more than she let on, or maybe I was just paranoid. I wasn't sure anymore. That night, Barbara called and asked me to come over. Her voice sounded fragile, uneven in a way I'd never heard before. When I arrived, she was pacing her living room, clutching a half-filled glass of wine, her hands trembling slightly. She told me she had been hiding something from me, something about her past, about Melissa's father. I felt the air shift as though the room tightened around us, and when she finally sat down, I could tell the story she was about to reveal would change everything. She described a man named Robert, someone she'd been with long before Melissa was born, a man whose charm had concealed how controlling and dangerous he truly was. She spoke of threats, manipulation, and the fear that had driven her to leave him. She said she thought she had escaped that part of her life, only to learn he had continued watching her from a distance. Then she told me something that knocked the breath from my lungs. Robert knew who I was. I asked how, and she hesitated before revealing the truth in a quiet, trembling voice. Robert wasn't just Melissa's father, he was mine as well. My mind reeled, everything I thought I knew collapsing inward. My own mother had always told me my father was a nameless addict who abandoned us, but Barbara insisted the truth was more complicated. My mother had left Robert the moment she discovered the kind of man he really was, protecting herself and me from his influence. She had kept my existence hidden for years, but somehow he had learned about me eventually. Barbara told me that once he discovered our relationship, he confronted her, giving her an ultimatum that made her voice tremble as she repeated it. If she didn't end things with me and remove herself from my life, he would use his resources to make sure everything I cared about, my reputation, my job, my safety, would fall apart. Hearing those words felt like stepping into a storm without shelter, but beneath the terror was a strange clarity, a realization that my life had been connected to his shadow long before I ever knew his name. Barbara said she had tried to protect me, but she couldn't keep the truth buried any longer. And as I sat there, absorbing everything, I understood that whatever future we imagined for ourselves could no longer exist without confronting the man who tied our lives together in ways neither of us ever asked for. When I left Barbara's house that night, the world outside felt different, as though the quiet suburban streets were holding their breath in anticipation of what would come next. The glow from porch lights and passing headlights blurred together as I drove, my thoughts spinning wildly around the revelation that the man who had haunted Barbara's past was also tethered to me in a way I never could have imagined. I replayed every detail she had shared, trying to assemble a coherent image of a father I had never known, but everything felt fractured and impossible, a puzzle missing entire sections. Sleep was useless. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the fear in Barbara's expression, the tremble in her voice when she repeated his ultimatum, the way she kept her arms wrapped around herself as if she were trying to hold in all the years she had spent outrunning his influence. I knew then that avoiding him would only allow him to continue casting shadows across our lives, and though the thought terrified me, something inside me hardened with determination. The next morning, I texted Barbara, telling her we needed to confront this together, and though she hesitated, she eventually agreed to help me arrange a meeting. She warned me about his temper, his manipulation, the way he liked to twist conversations until you doubted your own memory. But I insisted. If he had shaped our lives without our consent, then facing him was the only way to reclaim whatever fragments of control we still possessed. The meeting place was his office, a tall, sterile building downtown that looked as though it had been drained of all color. Walking through the lobby felt like stepping into some kind of staged performance, where everyone knew their lines except for me. Employees moved briskly with clipped nods and neutral faces, none of them aware that the man they worked for carried entire histories of pain behind polished doors. When I was finally led upstairs, my palms were damp and my throat dry, but I forced myself to steady my breathing. The receptionist's voice sounded distant as she announced me, and when the office door opened, revealing a man whose smile was too smooth, too measured, I felt the air tighten around my ribs. He looked at me as if greeting an expected guest, rather than a secret revealed too late. There was something unsettling in the way he carried himself, controlled, calculated, as though he were always several steps ahead of any conversation. He welcomed me with a tone that pretended warmth, but beneath it lingered an arrogance that made my stomach twist. He spoke my name slowly, savoring it, and I realized he had been preparing for this moment far longer than I had. When I told him I knew the truth, that Barbara had told me everything, his expression didn't crack. Instead, he simply sighed, as though he were disappointed I had heard the story from someone else, rather than directly from the source he believed himself to be. As he spoke, I saw through every polished word he wielded like a weapon. He talked about family legacy and responsibility, about reputations that needed safeguarding, but none of his explanations felt like truths. They were scripted performances, carefully designed to make me question myself. He insisted that he had kept his distance for my protection, claiming that life with my mother had been unstable and full of misunderstandings. Hearing him twist her reality, her sacrifices, into fabrications made my chest tighten with anger. He said that now, with everything out in the open, he expected me to step into the life he believed I should have had, one rooted in obedience, image, and control. Any resistance, he warned, would reflect poorly not only on me but on him, and he made it achingly clear that he did not tolerate anything that tarnished his carefully constructed world. Each sentence felt like a threat layered beneath a paternal mask, and though my hands trembled, I forced myself not to look away. I told him I wanted nothing from him, not his name, not his approval, not the power he dangled like bait. His false pleasantness evaporated the moment I rejected him. His eyes hardened, revealing the truth Barbara had tried to protect me from. A man who believed people were possessions and that losing control was the worst humiliation imaginable. When he realized he couldn't intimidate me by charm, his voice dropped to a chilling calm as he warned that I was aligning myself with someone who had betrayed him more than once, someone who would always bring trouble. Someone he claimed to be saving me from. It wasn't hard to recognize the desperation beneath his composure, and knowing that struck something deep inside me, a flicker of strength I hadn't recognized before. Leaving his office was like breaking through the surface of deep water. Each step away from him became easier to breathe, but the shock of everything lingered as I reached my car. When I finally saw Barbara later that day, she rushed toward me with worry etched across her face. But when I told her I was okay, she exhaled with a trembling relief. We talked for hours, not just as conspirators in a complicated truth, but as two people bound by shared fears and unasked-for histories. She apologized again and again for not telling me sooner, but I assured her that I understood why she had tried to protect me. The years she spent outrunning him had left scars she rarely allowed anyone to see, and sitting beside her, I felt the weight of everything she had been forced to carry alone. Our connection, once fueled by secrecy and emotion, deepened into something steadier, something forged in the fire of everything we had uncovered. For the first time since all of this began, I felt anchored, not because the situation had become easier, but because we were facing it side by side. In the weeks that followed, the aftermath of confronting Robert rippled into every part of our lives. Barbara and I became cautious out of necessity, watching for signs that he might retaliate in ways we couldn't predict. There were moments when Barbara would freeze mid-conversation, startled by a phone call or a car she didn't recognize, her past trauma resurfacing despite her attempts to stay composed. I'd sit with her during those moments, reminding her gently that fear no longer dictated our choices, that the truth being exposed meant we were no longer living under illusions. At work, we maintained a careful distance whenever others were around. Those small glances and quiet, shared smiles revealed what remained unspoken. Some nights we sat together for hours, talking through the tangled mess of family, identity, and the strange paths that had brought us to each other. I learned pieces of my mother's struggle that I had never known, and Barbara shared memories of the early years with Melissa, back when hope had outweighed fear for a brief time before everything had turned. Our conversations became threads weaving together two separate lives into a shared understanding neither of us expected. As the tension slowly loosened its grip, we found ways to move forward, carving out small pockets of peace amid uncertainty. There was a quiet strength in the way Barbara faced her past now, not with avoidance, but with a determination that rivaled my own. I could see the shift in her posture, the softening in her eyes on days when laughter came more easily, and even though the situation was far from resolved, something inside us both had begun to heal. I, too, found myself changing. The revelation of my father's identity, though jarring and painful, had granted me a strange new clarity about who I was. I no longer felt weighed down by the version of myself I had carried for years. Someone undefined, searching, unaware of the shadows trailing behind her. Instead, I felt grounded in the decision to face the truth with open eyes rather than let it shape me in secret. In choosing not to let Robert dictate my path, I had taken back something intangible but vital, a sense of self I hadn't realized I was missing. Eventually, the tumult settled into something manageable, still complicated, still tinged with uncertainty but no longer suffocating. Barbara and I didn't try to define what we were or what we weren't. The bond between us had evolved beyond titles, resting in a space shaped by mutual trust and experience rather than expectation. When we were alone together, the quiet comfort we once shared returned with new depth, grounded by everything we had faced. We walked together through late evening streets, speaking softly about hopes rather than fears, imagining lives no longer worn thin by the pressure of someone else's control. We didn't pretend the world was suddenly perfect or simple, but we recognized that surviving the truth had given us something solid to hold on to. In the end, the story that could have fractured my entire sense of identity instead opened the path for something truer. Barbara and I remained close, intertwined not by secrecy, but by choice, supporting each other as we stepped into futures neither of us yet understood. Robert may have believed he had the power to dictate our lives, but standing together, we had proven something far more enduring, that his influence ended where our resolve began. The truth, messy and painful as it was, had freed us. It had given us the chance to rebuild our lives on our own terms, without fear of shadows or whispered threats. And as I moved forward, I carried with me not the weight of his name, but the strength of having faced him, and the certainty that no matter how turbulent the past had been, the person I was becoming belonged entirely to me.